Hello, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name's John Catapan. I'm the Director of the VCA. Tonight it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to this inaugural event for the Art of Science initiative between the VCA and the Biomedical Sciences precinct at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the land that we are meeting on. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my deep respects to the elders past, present and future of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I like to remind people who are gathered on these lands that these were sites of much dancing, much art making, much ceremonial gathering, not unlike tonight, and more than just a little experimentation with the land, so most appropriate. And we thank the elders for allowing us to meet on what is still their lands. Science and art are often considered opposites, but in fact the similarities between artists and scientists far outweigh the difference. There is real value to be gained from interdisciplinary collaborations that bring artists and scientists together. Artists and scientists are both creative in their endeavours, both explore new boundaries, undertake research and ask questions and seek to explore the undiscovered and unseen. Our places of work, the science lab and the artist's studio, are both places of open-ended inquiry for learning by doing, for experimentation and for innovation. Collaboration between the arts and science has the potential to create new knowledge, ideas and processes between both fields. Collaborations open up new ways of seeing and experience the world around us, share different perspectives and communicate, and advance our thinking and responses to address the big challenges of our times. This is in fact the embodiment of the Melbourne model. How can scientists and artists work together to create awareness, communicate complex messages that resonate with a public audience? Tonight's set of mini lectures, if you will, is a start on that path. So we are aiming between us, the VCA and the medicine faculty, to create an ongoing relationship through this collaboration, through this initiative, which will see us in 2018 come together in a very major symposium that will explore some of the issues that have just been raised through the speakers this evening. Artists and scientists have not always been quite so separate, and in fact if one goes back to the Renaissance and thinks of an artist like Leonardo da Vinci, he was indeed both artist and scientist. By the 1700s, within the academy, which we are all a part of here, there was a scientific revolution underway, and the academy slowly let scientists in. What had been a philosophical model in the universities gave way to a model that allowed a kind of experimentation of things that were of the world. And this is where artists and scientists come together. And so it is in this spirit that we come together this evening to explore largely the topic of storm asthma, a very, very important topic, but also the idea of how artists can insert, interpolate and extrapolate from some of those issues that emanate from, I guess, one of the really unexpected events of the past few years. I'm guessing that in this room not so many people had heard the term storm asthma before last year. I know that from a very personal perspective, we at the VCA had our major undergraduate exhibition opening the night of the Storm Asthma event, and in fact an ambulance was called to the VCA, so we have a very personal connection to it. So we are, all of us here this evening, all of the speakers, and they are all eminent, the people you will hear from, are deeply committed to this initiative and excited about its future prospects. So tonight we'll talk about the public health challenge of asthma, and in particular thunderstorm asthma, and we'll also talk laterally, perhaps, about the artistic extrapolations of science. This is through my colleague Patricia Piccinini's work with the accident trauma research. And I would like to begin by, my role here is essentially to introduce the speakers, and I'd like to begin by introducing Professor Alistair Stewart, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about his work. Alistair has extensive experience in the field of respiratory and inflammation research. He has published over 200 papers, has had 3 patents proceed to grant, and has served on numerous peer review committees for the National Health and Medical Research Council and the scientific advisory boards of several Australian medical research institutes. Alistair currently chairs the Therapeutic Technologies Research Initiative. He is the Director of the Australian Research Council Industry Transformation Training Centre for Personalised Therapeutics Technologies. He is a co-director of the Lung Health Research Centre and a Professor of Pharmacology in the School of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Please welcome Professor Alistair Stewart.
Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to John and Maria for bringing us this event, but also bringing us the excitement of a potential interaction of students and faculty between arts and science. I'm sure that each will be enriched as we progress this initiative through to the symposium planned for next year. I have no artistic ability, unfortunately, but I see art in science all the time, and to me it's really well exemplified by what's going on screen. On screen you're looking at a small molecule. Here it is dancing around. It engages with the top of what we call a receptor. This is the protein which senses the presence of a drug, and it's finding its way down into the heart of the receptor in order to have an effect on that receptor. This short looping video represents the culmination of efforts by thousands upon thousands, literally thousands upon thousands of pharmacologists and structural biologists taking place over decades to generate the insights that are required to see exactly how this event occurs. And when I was a student, one could only have imagined this kind of interaction because there was no way of seeing what happened. So for the first time we can see. And it happens, no, much faster than that. It's 5 microseconds. So 1,000 times faster than the snap of my fingers is how long it takes for this drug to bind to its receptor. This actually is very similar in shape to the active ingredient in the so-called reliever drug that was so important for the many asthmatics who suffered acute asthma during the thunderstorm of last November 21. And we see that there are different types of drugs needed. So this blue canister contains the reliever drug, but actually there's an even greater need for preventer drugs that will alter the likelihood of these events recurring. I draw your attention to this phrase here. So there's art in communication, and I see great art in this communication. If you can't breathe, nothing else matters. I even beat the cardiologists with that one. They haven't got an answer. So We see here some artwork generated by the simulation of the binding of the ligand to its receptor. The red lines indicate where it's spent very short amount of time, and the blue lines indicate where it's resided for some period, binding to particular aspects of the receptor. And so it denotes in a colour gradient how the drug has found its way into the receptor. And it really has some elegance. It's almost sensual, I think, the way that the ligand finds its way into the depths of this receptor. I could play the video all night, but it's time to move on. In fact, it's time in the form of circadian rhythm. So we don't think so much about circadian rhythm outside of jet lag, but actually there's a vast number of impacts of time of day on our physiology and on our response to drugs. And this was recognised by Horatius in his chapter 11 on asthma, written in the 1st century. When exactly, we don't know. But he refers to asthma as being evident by the eyes protuberant as if from strangulation, aral, and Lou will tell me that I've mispronounced that term, but it means a rattling in the lungs during the waking. But importantly, what he noticed was that the evil is much worse in sleep. And so we wind the clock forward 2,000 years and in a few weeks, and here is Mike Rosbash, Jeffrey Hall and Mike Young, and about 3 weeks ago they won the Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology, and they won it for their discovery of a key protein involved in regulating the biological clock. And I'll show you some workings of this, and I know that there'll be different disciplines in the audience, and that some of you may have some physiology or some engineering, and you might recognise a negative feedback loop here. Here's the Nobel Prize-winning discovery of the protein period regulating our circadian rhythm, and it feeds back on clock, and clock can regulate genes involved in inflammation, metabolism, and oxidation. And there's a side reaction here, metabolised by this enzyme casein kinase 1 delta, which causes degradation of the period. And this can alter the amplitude of the operation of the clock. So with that, we see that there are opportunities to modulate this pathway. In fact, my group had started some work some time ago, time is a constant feature here, that explored the effect of blocking casein kinase 1 delta. And what we have found is that the blocking of the active site of this particular enzyme with small molecules is able to suppress inflammation and fibrosis, and the small molecules show some potential in the application to asthma. So it's not often that I have a public opportunity to thank the people involved in the research in my laboratory, and I really want to pay tribute to Shinna Langbach, Maina Lee and Trudy Harris in particular, who've been with this project over its whole duration and have seen it through to fruition. We were fortunate enough this year to secure NHMRC funding for a development grant. I might add that it's on the 5th attempt, but we were delighted to receive this support, which enables us to take the work forward to the potential of translating for the needs of those who are suffering from asthma, where the medications that are currently available don't entirely satisfy the requirements for a symptom-free life. Importantly, our research efforts have been supported by a number of grant funding agencies, including the Australian Research Council, National Health Medical Research Council, and importantly Asthma Australia, who kept the funding for this work going when the other funding sources dwindled and were not renewed. And so we're particularly grateful to Asthma Australia for their ongoing support enabling this development. And I should thank the donors of the tissues and the cells that we use in our research so that we can maintain our relevance. We use cells from human donors, and those come to us in various forms, but Donate Life is a particularly important collaborator in obtaining tissues for medical research. And so I acknowledge the efforts that that group takes to ensure the relevance of what we do and of all our supporters. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Stewart. Associate Professor Lewis Irving is the Clinical Director of the Lung Health Research Centre at the University of Melbourne and a respiratory physician at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre. Director of Respiratory and Sleep Medicine and Director of Clinical Training at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. He holds 2 fellowships here at the University of Melbourne in Medicine and Physiology. His clinical teaching and research interests focus primarily on lung cancer and chronic lung diseases, including bronchitis, emphysema, and asthma. Please welcome Associate Professor Lewis Irving.
Thank you. I've got the same disclosure that Alistair had. I'm not an artist, and that'll become apparent. But before my 2 young colleagues talk about thunderstorm asthma, I'd like to give you a quick tutorial on what the lungs do and how they might be affected by disease. And so the main role of the lungs is to transfer oxygen into blood and to remove carbon dioxide from blood. And for an oxygen molecule, it's the beginning of a pathway from the lungs to its use in the tissues as the most important substrate of metabolism. And for a carbon dioxide molecule, the lungs are the end of a journey as a waste product from the tissues to the lungs to be exhaled. It's very important that the lungs supply oxygen at the rate that it's needed and remove carbon dioxide at the rate it's being produced. And the capacity of the system varies from around 300 mils a minute, and for us at the moment, sitting quietly at rest, maybe thinking a little bit, we're consuming about 500 mils of oxygen a minute and producing a similar amount of carbon dioxide. But at peak exercise, our tissues can use over 4 litres of oxygen a minute and produce a similar amount of waste product. And therefore, the lungs, as part of this coordinated system that includes the heart and the blood vessels, has to be able to keep up with metabolism, both when we're resting and when we're exercising. The gas exchange in the lungs occurs across a very thin membrane called the alveolar capillary membrane. It's about 5 micron thick, and it consists of an air sac or alveolar cell and a blood vessel or capillary cell and a shared basement membrane. So here's a cartoon of it, and this is what it actually looks like under a scanning microscope. Here's a blood vessel, here's an air sac, and oxygen is passing this way, carbon dioxide is passing that way. Now, to do all the things that we want to be able to do, to exercise at peak capacity, the surface membrane, the surface area of the membrane needs to be about the size of a tennis court. And therefore, if it was packaged as a single sphere in our chest, the radius of our chest would be about 6 metres, and we'd be the sort of the size of a dinosaur. But whoever, in fact, invented us solved the packaging problem by dividing that membrane into 200 million tiny sacs, and then packaged those 200 million tiny sacs into the volume of our thorax, which is about 6 litres in volume. And each of those sacs is supplied by a branching bronchial and then bronchiolar structure. And the whole structure, in fact, is symmetrical. It's a fractal organ, and it means that each of those air sacs is equidistant from the mouth, and each of the blood vessels supplying the air sacs and the capillary bed that surrounds each air sac is equidistant from the heart. And so it's highly efficient. So conceptually, the lungs are like a very large railway platform with a number of elevator belts bringing millions of molecules to the platform and removing millions of molecules from the platform, and a continuous train allowing molecules to alight and allowing molecules to disembark. And unlike our railway system, there are never any empty seats and there's never any standing. It's perfectly coordinated. And as our metabolic need increases, the rate at which that train passes the station increases so that homeostasis is maintained. More molecules hop on the train, more molecules hop off the train, so that the blood levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide, even at peak exercise, are maintained the same as at rest. So that's the way normal lungs work, and it's an absolute miracle. What happens in asthma? In asthma, there is sudden narrowing of the air tubes, of those escalators that I drew in the cartoon, and that narrowing occurs because of constriction of muscle around the airways and because of chemical reactions that occur within the airways, inflammation, just like the inflammation that occurs if you scald your skin or if you get an infection on your skin. And this is what a bronchial tube looks like in an asthma attack. It's red and inflamed. If we cut a section, we can see inflammatory cells and narrowing of the bronchial tree, and here are some air sacs next to the bronchial tree. And this is a person who unfortunately died, but these are bronchi that are open, but these bronchi are filled with mucus and inflammatory secretions. And we can measure what's happening to the ventilation and the blood supply to the lung by asking a person to breathe in radioactive substances, and it becomes inhomogeneous rather than uniform. And we can measure the effect on breathing capacity in the laboratory, and instead of a normal green triangle showing a large amount of air, we can show airflow obstruction. So the orderly alighting and disembarking of the platform is disturbed because of the chaos that's occurring in the airways leading up to the alveolar capillary membrane. And if it's disturbed enough, it means that the train leaves the station with empty seats of oxygen, so the tissues do not become oxygenated enough. And it also means that carbon dioxide molecules that should be getting off the train, in fact, keep circulating. And those carbon monoxide molecules are the main source of acid in the body. So the body becomes acidic and lacks oxygen, hypoxic. So with that as an introduction, I'll hand over to my two very clever colleagues who studied thunderstorm asthma very closely during the storm. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Irving. Now, we have two colleagues who are about to speak, and the first one is Dr. Nurshireen Harun, who's a respiratory physician at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and a University of Melbourne Lung Health Research Centre collaborator. She runs the Severe Asthma Service at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and is currently actively researching thunderstorm asthma and the treatment for severe asthma. Please make her welcome.
Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Basically, I'm going to try and give you a snapshot of the phenomenon of thunderstorm asthma, which has been highly publicised over the last 12 months. So what actually happened? So on the 21st of November, Melbourne experienced the largest thunderstorm epidemic of asthma event to date, and this is worldwide. The number of people developing acute symptoms of asthma, so sudden and severe symptoms of asthma, very rapidly overwhelmed health resources. And there were 3,000 excess respiratory-related presentations to hospital, and overall a 992% increase in asthma-related admissions over 30 hours. So very dramatic. And very tragically, this culminated in 9 asthma deaths. So if you know, a picture can sort of speak 1,000 words, I think this is basically a graph of timing of calls to the emergency services on the night of the 21st of November. And we can see a pretty short and sharp spike at about 6 a.m. when emergency calls began to be received. And between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m, there were about 510 call-outs for, requests for emergency ambulances to attend people with very sudden and severe breathing problems. Over the next 12 hours, there were about 2,000 emergency calls, and probably at the peak between 7 and 7:15, there were 210 calls. So certainly quite an overwhelming number of calls to handle. In terms of presentations to hospital, there were about 9,000 patients that presented to emergency departments across Melbourne. And this is roughly 3,000 more than would be expected, 3,000 more than the week before. Thunderstorm asthma isn't a phenomenon that's unique to Australia. There's been reported events since roughly the mid-1980s in the UK, North America, Iran and Europe. But Australia does seem to be a hotspot. There have been episodes in New South Wales and around Wagga Wagga, but Melbourne itself has had at least 5 previous events, nowhere near the severity of what we saw last year, however. They all seem to have occurred during November, which really coincides with peak ryegrass pollen season. So what needs to happen, and why did this happen? There appears to be about 4 requisite conditions for thunderstorm asthma to occur. Firstly, there needs to be a high concentration of air allergens or irritants in the air, which we, in this event, attribute to ryegrass pollen from pastoral grasslands north and west of Melbourne. What then needs to happen is a rapid rise in humidity and with a thunderstorm, moisture essentially rupturing each pollen grain such that hundreds of starch molecules are released from the one pollen grain. The thunderstorm track then carries these pollen grains down essentially to a metropolitan centre, which was roughly Melbourne CBD, and brings it down to a level that's breathable to the general population. And thus, people that are potentially sensitive to this are exposed, and those that are susceptible can undergo, as Lou had mentioned, airway narrowing and inflammation. So this is one of the slides from Ed Newbegin's lab, which shows essentially part of what was seen on the night in terms of the aerobiology with pollen grains that are rupturing. There's also fungus that was seen, which has been implicated in previous thunderstorm asthma events overseas, but as we'll talk about, my colleague will talk about later, we don't think was, although it was in the air, perhaps less relevant for our event last year. So 21st of November appears to have been essentially a perfect storm in terms of lining up of all the things that were required for a thunderstorm event to happen, with high temperatures, high humidity, wind speeds, and pollen in the air. So as we talk about, hospitals were completely overwhelmed. But not only that, pharmacies and local medical practitioners also dealt with a lot of the flood of people that presented anywhere, essentially, for help. Salbutamol, the short-acting reliever for asthma, was in short supply. And patients were discharged from sort of wherever they were initially seen without proper follow-up due to the huge demand on health services. Overall, apart from the thousands of people that presented to the emergency departments, about 476 patients were admitted to hospitals over Melbourne, 44 to an intensive care unit, which is in a critical condition. Unfortunately, as we'd said, 9 people died from this. So I guess a very pertinent question is who is at risk, and certainly it's something that we were very interested in. We know that a precondition for thunderstorm asthma is a ryegrass pollen allergy. What we know is that the majority of people who presented to hospital knew they had asthma, but also concerningly was that there were some that developed asthma for the first time, so certainly a very frightening position to be in. And we know that allergic rhinitis is associated with a 3.5-fold risk of asthma, so this is hay fever. So in terms of next steps, part of which we were trying to contribute to is really going to be a collaboration between lots of different people and lots of different agencies, and this is looking at the weather, predicting events, how can we predict thunderstorms, thunderstorm asthma, and the relevant factors that will align. What's in the air, essentially, and how climate change may affect this with increasingly extremes of weather. And then where we were, I guess, more up front and centre was the patients and how we identify those at high risk for future events. Should guidelines be changed to somehow incorporate what we saw on the night of the 21st of November? Should patients be offered the inhaled corticosteroids, the longer-term preventers at different stages, and immunotherapy, so desensitisation. And then the other aspect then is, I guess, the public health promotion of these messages to the general population. So that's where I'm going to end and pass over to my colleague who'll talk more about what we've done on the ground. Thank you.
Dr. Philippe Lachapelle is a Canadian physician specialising in respiratory medicine. He currently works as a clinical research postdoctoral fellow at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and the Lung Health Research Centre at the University of Melbourne. Philippe has strong interests in asthma and is currently actively researching thunderstorm asthma. Philippe has been involved in identifying novel risk factors for asthma exacerbation for the November 2016 thunderstorm asthma epidemic. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So, I'll present a little bit more how the Royal Melbourne Hospital was affected by thunderstorm asthma and what we can learn from the patient who presented to the emergency the 21st and 22nd of November. So maybe you noticed from my French-Canadian accent, I'm from Montreal, and in Montreal we have another different type of storm, which is mainly a snowstorm. And this is a nice picture from the storm of the century in Montreal in 1971. There was an accumulation around 60, 70 centimeters of snow within 24 hours. And that's important for us, a physician, and when I was trained as a physician in Montreal, because there's a strong association between snow shoveling and earth attack, and it was demonstrated mainly. And you know that if you are on call after a snowstorm, you would be busy, that's for sure. But here, during my training, which is more related to my specialty, I was involved in thunderstorm asthma. So we nicely showed that with all the pollen of the ryegrass in the air, Dr. Arun demonstrated that was affected the airways and the lower airway of the lung with some closure and an asthma exacerbation. So how the Royal Melbourne Hospital was affected. So how it was affected with the snowstorm. So while the storm was coming in Melbourne the 21st of November 2016, there was as Dr. Aaron demonstrated in Melbourne, but also at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, there was increase of asthma presentation at the emergency of the hospital. And we see that around 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, so the storm came through around 6 o'clock, but during that time there was markedly increase of asthma presentation. So 240 patients presented at the emergency with an asthma attack. Most of the patients were coming from the inner city and another suburb of the city to the hospital. I think a good way to present how this event was dramatic is to present a quick case that we saw. That was one of the first patients that I saw at the asthma clinic when we offer a follow-up for those patients. So most of the patients were young patients. So she is a 33-year-old female, born in Mauritius Island, and she immigrated like many other patients presented to Australia in the last. She immigrated in 2008. She was a non-smoker with a typical history of asthma. So allergies when she was young, childhood asthma. And one important characteristic that we want to emphasize, she had uncontrolled asthma symptoms prior to the thunderstorm. However, she was on preventer therapy. So the main preventative therapy is inhaled corticosteroid medication. The 21st of November, around 6:30, she was home with her 2 children with the windows open. And it was one of the first hot days of the spring or beginning of the summer that year. And she had quite sudden increased shortness of breath, wheezing, sneezing at that time. And suddenly she was not able to breathe anymore. She lost consciousness, and when she fell, she broke her nose, found by her husband who just arrived home. And she was cardiac massage by her husband in front of the children. With the amazing job of the paramedic, she was resuscitated, brought to the ICU, and she was discharged from the hospital 2 days later. So to better understand what happened that night and to know what are the characteristics of the asthma patient, we offered follow-up of all the patients who went to the emergency for asthma. And so there was approximately 240 that present to the asthma in clinic, and we attempted to contact every patient. There was a lot of patients visiting or people that we didn't have the information to contact them, but we were able to follow 70 patients at the clinic. And we offer a clinical evaluation and also some lung function testing and blood tests to look at specific allergy to better understand which type of asthma they have. So if we look, most of the patients were young adults, so the mean age was 35 years old, half were female, and most of the patients were not Caucasian, so were either born Asian, Indian, or others. Most were also were born overseas, and almost all of the patients had allergic rhinitis as a clinical background, hay fever. If we look, if there's any characteristic that was associated with a severe hospitalization, so a severe exacerbation, so we look about people who were hospitalized and non-hospitalized. So the fact that being indoor or outdoor didn't make any difference. However, we would strongly encourage to, if another asthma, to be inside the windows closed. So if we look at the population, 63% were known asthmatic. So most of the people were known asthmatic, and people with no diagnosis of asthma and never had any symptom was a small proportion. This group was real, but people that we call latent asthma was only 20%. What is interesting, the risk of being hospitalized with or having a severe exacerbation seems a little bit less in that group, which is in fact reassuring. One of the main risk factors of having a severe exacerbation was to have uncontrolled asthma the month prior to the thunderstorm, so people with asthma symptoms prior. If we look about other characteristics, so there was in the cohort, there was only 17% that were on preventer therapy, so inhaled corticosteroid therapy. And most people who had severe exacerbation were the ones with a lot of hay fever symptoms, which was demonstrated with a questionnaire which is called the SNOT-22, which was significant, and also with people with a lot of asthma inflammation in their blood. So we look at blood eosinophilia, which was associated with more severe exacerbation. People with mildly lower lung function, however, in the limit of the normal, also seem to have a little bit more severe exacerbation in the cohort. One of the main findings of our cohort was looking about specific allergies for every patient. So we'll look about specific protein in the blood, the IgE, to look if they were allergic. And if we look specifically about the ryegrass, people had very high ryegrass sensitization. So every patient who presented for an asthma attack that we followed were sensitized. And more you were allergic, more you had high IgE, more you were at risk of being hospitalized. As Dr. Arun mentioned, we'll look also about fungal sensitization, which was not really high in the cohort. So what can we learn to provide asthma, thunderstorm asthma policy and be prepared for other thunderstorm asthma events? Is to look about the risk factors. So we know that all patients who had an attack were sensitized to ryegrass, and IgE to ryegrass might be related to a worst factor of having an attack. Also, being uncontrolled, having some asthma symptom was really important and was associated. So this reinforced that people need to have controlled asthma. So we go back to the baseline of treating asthma with inhaled corticosteroid and make sure that the patient are on preventer. And there was a nice study in 2000 published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Sousa that showed that only 4 canisters of inhaled corticosteroid per year, so a small amount, will reduce your risk of dying from asthma to 0. Finally, it's important, the emergency was overwhelmed, so it's important to be ready at the emergency, to have some bronchodilatator, but also make sure that we treat with corticosteroid to decrease the inflammation, and that we instruct patients that they need to be on preventer therapy to make sure that they don't have further exacerbation during the hay fever season, the spring season. Ultimately, also having a diagnosis with spirometry would help to come from the diagnosis. Thank you very much.
Dr. Maria Belesis is a volunteer in the Department of Pharmacology and Therapeutics at the University of Melbourne, assisting in the Lung Health Research Centre and the Stewart Laboratory. Maria has previously worked as a hospital scientist at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, a research scientist at the University of Melbourne, and a clinical research scientist in the pharmaceutical industry. Her interests include art and, more recently, science-inspired poetry. And, ladies and gentlemen, it is Maria, who's coming up to the podium now, who is largely responsible for this evening's proceedings. And I'm a great believer in things taking shape organically and from the ground up. And Maria is a terrific exemplar of this, someone who's just worked with tremendous enthusiasm to draw everyone together this evening. Thank you, Maria.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome tonight. And I feel very privileged to be here. And I have a confession to make. I love both art and science, and I don't think that I'm alone. Inspiration, colour, texture, shape, beauty, awe, technique, technology, curiosity, discovery, mystique, inquiry, studio, or laboratory are terms that apply equally to both art and science. The secret is there has always been art in science, in my view. In their day-to-day activities, scientists often observe images of sublime and breathtaking beauty. They create posters and diagrams and record wonders that are often rarely shared outside their field. This is starting to change. Contemplating the art of science has inspired me to write on the poetry of science, and tonight it is my great pleasure to read to you 2 short science-inspired poems that I have written. The first one, called The Scientist, I dedicate to all the scientists who are moved by the wonder they observe and have pursued their subjects with passion. The second one is for Thunderstorm Asthma. The little cells that I see below the cover slip near me, bright blues, pinks and reds, all snug in their beds, I ponder and pause, it's for a good cause. I study, I note, I count as they float. I work day, I work night, when it's sunny and bright, when it's windy and grey, in the lab I still stay. It takes days, it takes weeks, but when science speaks, I'll be there, I'll be ready, my hand will be steady. The paper I'll write, get it down black and white. What a joy when it's done, I'll have savoured the fun. Now off to the journal, let my work be eternal. Thunderstorms in Melbourne can really be bad. All that ryegrass, that pollen, it can truly get sad. Lots of coughing, let's do something. If we don't, we'll be suffering. In Melbourne, the asthma's quite mad. Thank you.
Professor Patricia Piccinini is an internationally recognised artist working in a variety of media, including painting, video, sound, digital prints and sculpture. Professor Piccinini presents innovative installations that grapple with themes such as medical science, virtual reality and technology. Her work has been widely exhibited internationally since 1991, and in 2003 she had the honour of representing Australia at the 50th Venice Biennale. Patricia Piccinini is arguably one of Australia's most important internationally exhibited sculptors. Please welcome her.
Sorry, I've got quite a hoarse voice because I've been speaking for 4 days up in Canberra. So okay. So I'm a visual artist, and my practice is focused on bodies and relationships. The relationships between people and other creatures. Between people and our bodies, between creatures and the environment, between the artificial and the natural. I'm particularly interested in the way that the everyday realities of the world around us, particularly technologies like genetic engineering and biotechnology, change these relationships. My work aims to shift the way that people look at the world around them and question their assumptions about the relationships they have with the world and the other creatures in it. I ask how contemporary technology and culture changes our understanding of what it means to be human. I'm also interested in ethical issues that arise when we change nature. While ethics are central, my approach is always ambiguous and questioning rather than moralistic and didactic. I'm interested in emotional responses as much as rational ones, as I strongly believe that all decisions are ultimately affected by both. Fundamentally, I look at the shifting boundary between the artificial and the natural in contemporary life and question both where that boundary lies and whether it is a useful distinction to draw. I might look at genetically modified organisms and ask how you can call it artificial when it's all its DNA and ultimately even the modifying technology, for example CRISPR, are drawn from nature. I would even suggest that such nebulous boundaries are as old as humans. You could ask the same question of bonsai plants, which are simultaneously completely natural and completely contrived. The point of this is not to somehow get to the truth of where this boundary lies, but instead to get to the point that this idea of a boundary between the artificial and the natural is essentially meaningless, or at least perhaps redundant. The point is really to tease out these implications of what we do and how it impacts on people. And my goal is to empower discussion, but not to instruct. Ideas rather than methods are central to my work and the way I work. And I work with whatever media seems best suited to evoking the sorts of thoughts and emotions that I'm interested in playing with. I don't work alone. I work with technicians and experts and fabricators, and I work across many media. Sculpture, installation, photography, video, drawing. I go from intimate drawings to gigantic public sculptures such as Skywell. So, when I was approached by Clemengers, a big advertising agency, who asked me if I wanted to work with them on a project for the TAC, the Transport Accident Commission, I told them no. I've been approached many times. I explained that I was an artist and I don't make props for ads. And they responded that that was in fact exactly why they wanted to work with me. They wanted to commission me to make an artwork, not an ad. They wanted me to do what I always do with an idea. They just wanted me to look at a particular idea and to help them, and to help me to connect to people who could tell me about it. Their reason for approaching me was that they felt that their traditional ads, which had been incredibly successful, were starting to lose impact as people became more used to them and generally more cynical and sceptical about advertising in general. They were like super successful, but in the end, nobody really wants to be told that they're a bloody idiot, and just wasn't getting through anymore. And so what they were looking at was something, what they were looking for was something that would have integrity and something that would get to people through non-traditional channels, like through word of mouth or social media, rather than through paid TV spots. I explained that I didn't take direction and that I would have to have complete creative freedom to make the sort of things that I normally make. And again, their response was agreement. That was exactly what they wanted to do, and they were willing to take the chance of letting it get out of their control. What they wanted to do was to put me in touch with some experts who could explain the issues and discuss my ideas with me, and to follow the process and create an educational campaign around the final work. We also agreed that it would always be an artwork displayed in art galleries rather than shopping malls, and would, in this way, retain its special status as an art object. Obviously, the whole project hinged on the fact that ultimately we all agreed on the social importance of what the TAC does. This is not a gambling company or even a car company. This is an organisation that is dedicated to reducing the road toll and saving lives and decreasing the negative impact of traffic accidents on the people of Victoria. And I'm a huge fan of what the TAC does and the way they do it. And the people I met were all incredibly committed to doing something that is undeniably good and useful. And ultimately, that is what I hope to do too, albeit in a much more subtle way. In the end, it wasn't hard to agree on a shared vision of what the work would hope to evoke in the viewer. So I decided to go ahead with the project, and together we came up with a subject for the work, a figure who would be designed to survive a fairly low impact, a low speed car accident. No one can survive a high impact car accident, either as a driver or as a pedestrian. The point of this was not to create something to aim for, but rather to highlight the vulnerabilities of our existing bodies. We decided that he should be a young male, as young males are most at risk and hardest to reach. This figure ended up being Graham. One of the things I maintain in my practice is that I'm not an expert. I discuss things that seem very scientific to lay people, but my information is always drawn from the general media or from discussions with people who actually are experts. I try to be as factual as possible, but I try not to be above my audience. I'm just as fascinated and confused as everyone else, and what I present is just one way of looking at things. Therefore, the core of this project was an ongoing series of discussions with a couple of people who genuinely were experts or are experts. Royal Melbourne Hospital trauma surgeon Christian Canfield and Monash University Accident Research Centre crash investigation expert Dr. David Logan. We had long and wide-ranging discussions on exactly what happens to the human body in a road accident, and it was an eye-opening situation for me and very sobering. And I'm not lying when I say that it's made me drive a lot slower. And in fact, the educative process that I went through with them was very much what we were hoping that the work would evoke. It also highlighted the difficulty in what we were hoping to achieve. In my first discussions with Christian at the Royal Melbourne, he told me flat out that what we were doing just wasn't going to work. That the young men we were hoping to get the most out of were impossible to reach. And that he'd actually seen young men in an accident come back and on his table again. And so, if a car accident wasn't enough to make them change their behaviour, he wasn't convinced. But he said it was worth a try. I could talk about what I learnt at length about speed and about the way brains bounce inside our skulls and the way that airbags actually work. But the most important point is that all of these discussions ended up feeding into Graham in a way that could later be explained to others, to people. However, Graham was not just a technical solution, it was a rhetorical one. There's more than one way that you can express all of the solutions to the particular physical problems that occur in a car accident. I didn't want Graham to be a Superman, something that you might look at and wish to be. Graham needed to remain human and retain some of the emotional vulnerability of a person. The modifications needed to serve two purposes. First, they needed to express the problem, i.e., that the impact speed needs to be slowed down so that the brain doesn't bounce around too much. And this had to be done in a way that could be explained. And secondly, they needed to convince people that perhaps having this kind of body would not be a wonderful, positive future outcome. We didn't want people aspiring to be Graham. The key idea was that the human body hasn't evolved to travel at the speed it currently does. Because if it was, it would look like this. And perhaps it is better to slow down rather than to become Graham. Graham had to look weird, fascinating and disturbing at the same time. On top of the sculpture itself, Clemengers developed an education program. One key to it was an augmented reality system, which was developed with a team of visualisers and medical illustrators to flesh out the anatomical details. They were inherent in my design, but not explicitly shown. So having this extra layer of visualisation was wonderful, as it simultaneously allowed the sculpture to remain an artwork, but also allowed viewers access to the underlying ideas. So you could just go to it and you could look through a screen and you could point at it and you could see through the sculpture. It was great. And these are some of the images from the AP app that Clemengers developed, and they show some of the key aspects of the design. And for me, this is how artworks work. They have layers of meaning. There's what they look like on the surface, and there are usually several layers of meaning underneath. Some of this underlying meaning is obvious, but much of it needs to be drawn out. The trick is to allow viewers to be involved in discovering it for themselves, to give them enough to get their teeth into without making it too obvious. It's more interesting to say, why does he have such a weird head? To protect his brain. But then, why is it all soft and squishy? Because when you drive fast, the brain bounces around in the skull and gets smashed up against the hard bone, so his head is fatty, which helps with that. Oh, yeah, I get it. The response to Graham when we launched it was amazing. it helped that we had Clemenger's understanding of the media and how it put things out into the world. But even they were taken by surprise by the way it exploded. It went viral, as they say. According to Campaign Brief, a magazine that tracks advertising, Graham was one of the top trending stories on Twitter and Facebook on the first weekend. He made headlines in the world's biggest newspapers and news sites, with articles appearing in publications including the New York Times, London's Daily Mail, the Washington Post, BBC, CNN, India Today, and Al Jazeera. Less than a week after Graham's reveal, the website had attracted more than 10.4 million page views, and some of Victoria's biggest news websites reported unprecedented traffic as Victorians scrambled to learn more about him. This led to huge interest in seeing him in public as he toured Victoria's regional galleries, and he's still on tour actually, especially from school groups who reported real enthusiasm. So the gallery reported real enthusiasm from their students to see the strange figure that they had seen on Facebook in person. The Graham campaign has gone on to win numerous advertising awards, including Gold Lions at Cannes and a bunch of others. I think one of the things that has worked in its favour was that it was cheap by their standards. They got unprecedented interest without having to pay for a single ad on TV or radio. In fact, they got the interest precisely because it wasn't an ad. I think the value of this was up to $27 million. For me, part of the process of the project, or the success of the project, was the way that it showed how art could be used alongside the TAC's more traditional methods to help to enhance their message without losing the integrity of the artwork. In fact, it was precisely because it was and remained an artwork that the campaign had the impact that it did. I believe that there is an unexpectedness in the work, as well as an honesty that speaks directly to audiences. I made a lot of choices in the work: the hair, the eyes, the clothing, the bench he sits on. They were all focused directly on creating the sort of connections with audience that I always look to doing in my own work. These were not in the brief. They're just how I work as an artist. And similarly, the TACs and Clemengers made a real effort to stand back and let me work. It was a real risk for them, and they didn't really know if it would work until it did. The reason why Graham worked was because everybody was allowed to do what they did best. Trauma surgeons are experts at fixing broken bodies. Crash investigators are experts at understanding the physics of car accidents. Artists are not good at either of those things. Artists are good at making things and telling stories. But sometimes the experts need someone to tell their stories. And I see this as a place where an artist can play a role by stepping in to create a connection between people and ideas.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have some closing remarks now by Professor Gary Anderson. Gary's a Professor of Pharmacology and Director of the Lung Health Research Centre at the University of Melbourne. He has spent his scientific life discovering new medicines for lung disease that have been used to treat millions of people around the world. He is also, I'm happy to report, a practising artist who holds an MFA in visual art from the VCA. His most recent work is grounded in research on the unexpected relationship between dance and minimalism and employs supercomputer simulations of collapsing soap bubbles whose reflective surfaces fleetingly capture glimpses of past performances. Please welcome Gary.
Well, thank you very much, John. The hardest thing about working in both art and science is to decide to put a tie on or not. So I'm a little bit more leaning to the art tonight. There's no tie on. The first job I have tonight is not to show you my work, I won't, but to thank people. So this first venture into the storm came from meeting colleagues at the VCA, sitting around the table and feeling a tremendous potentiality for science and art to come together, and yet that problem of what could we actually do? And it was John who brought to the table the metaphor of the storm that captivated us, and that became the focal point that led to this event, but also to what will be an ongoing collaboration between scientists in the medical faculty, physicians and colleagues at the VCA. So Alistair Stewart gave a superb introduction and showed us the limit of contemporary science, that visualisation of a very accurate simulation of the beta receptor. The word receptor was invented by the German scientist Paul Ehrlich at roughly the age of our young presenters tonight when he was a medical student. He wrote a report called Beitrag zur histological Farben, report on staining of tissues using dyes, because chemical dyes had just been invented at that time, and he realised that you could use them to stain tissue, and Lou Irving showed us pictures of asthmatic tissue decorated by these beautiful dyes to reveal their structure. But it was his genius to conceive that the dyes bound very specifically to a receptor, what he called a receptor, a receptive substance, and that is the notion that we still use of the receptor, conceived as an idea. Artistically, he drew pictures of what he imagined the receptors would look like, what their ligands would look like, remarkably like what we now know to be true. He also introduced the concept of the antibody, which is now one of the mainstays of medical science. So I ventured into formal training at the VCA really through what was, firstly through interest, always had an art practice, but really through personal crisis. When my youngest brother developed a brain tumour, and I reached out to everyone I knew at the heights of the world's pharmaceutical industry. What have you got for this glioblastoma? Nothing, nothing. For so many of the serious problems we face these days, the solutions are not there, and they are not obvious. We're in a marvellous brain institute. It was Leonardo da Vinci who first drew the nerve pathways connecting the eyes to the back of the brain. And we used to think that vision happened just here. But we now know through tensor imaging and other technologies that the visual cortex projects to most of the brain. And visual training hyperactivates other centres. So it was with an hypothesis in mind that by engaging formally in the practices of the artists at the VCA that my science might be slightly improved. What an amazing institution. What we don't realise in our modern world, which is so hypervisual, these synthetic colours, these technical devices, our interface technologies like iPhones, is that although we are saturated with images, we become less and less visual. We look in a fleeting way at images and we don't look for a long time. There is an amazingly, deeply changing experience you have at the VCA when you sit with leading artists and other artists in a group and look at one thing for 3 hours. One thing for 3 hours and talk about it. The phenomenon of what was initially not there being progressively revealed through deep looking and deep consideration. It's actually now something that's understood and has been formalised by scientists at Yale and Harvard who use sustained looking at artworks to teach visuality, to actually see what's in front of us rather than what we imagine is in front of us. And so we've seen incarnations of night, wonderful poetry from Maria, and thank you so much, Maria, for all of your work. Thank you to the colleagues at the VCA. Thank you to Sue Thornton, Seth Robinson, Stephanie Lamp, to Susan Norfield and Jackie Munro-Smith and Hong Yung for all the work in putting things together. But thank you in particular to our contributors. When you have a family member who is sick, you appreciate the art of the physicians. The ability not just to use the technology that we have, but the human dimension to bring healing forward. We think as basic scientists about technologies, but they can be very disquieting, as Patricia so vividly reveals in her own works. And so as we go forward thinking in Melbourne about how we will find solutions to the biggest, most challenging problems, it will be through collaborations between scientists, technologists, but also the creativity and the different way of thinking of the artist that might help us go forward. And it's with this reflection and point to the Storm, an ongoing project which I think will have great potential for us. And I'd like to thank all of our contributors tonight for an outstanding set of presentations that are very, very stimulating. I think the intent now is to invite our participants to the podium and to turn over to the public for questions, reflections, comments. So if you would like to come and join us here at the front. I'd be very happy to field any questions or comments or reflections from the audience. And why don't you tell us who you are before you ask your question or make your comment, just so we know.
My name is Nureush. I'm a medical doctor by training. I came actually from Ethiopia, East Africa. And I recently get my registration here in Australia. I'm planning to practice as a GP in New South Wales very soon. So I came, actually I'm interested in science and art. First in science because of my training, and later on in art because of the life events that happened to my family members. In 2004, I lost half of my family members in 1 week because of the epidemic. That night I was one of the collaborative surgeon. I was operating the whole night. I was on duty in obstetric department. And that night my father died, and two of my siblings again died in the subsequent days. And traveling for 3 days from the university that I used to work to my birthplace, I came to the remote area in eastern part of Ethiopia and saved the remaining family members who were actually on the days row because of acute diarrheal diseases, and I resuscitated my mom and two of my brothers. Just by opening IV line, I started them on antibiotic, on chloramphenicol, just on empirical treatment, considering that it could be typhoid fever, considering the history. And within 24 hours, they were actually brought in by what's known as a comparably equivalent with the local ambulance. I mean, people carry them and they brought to the local small health centers. I just resuscitated with IV fluid and antibiotic. And within 24 hours, they went back to home walking on foot. And everyone started to cry and thinking that if someone like you is interested in treating someone who needs help at that particular spot, would have saved your father and other sibling who lost just over a week period of time. And starting from that period, I started to advocate because I thought that tragic story was the story of millions of people, especially in Africa, where access to healthcare services is quite difficult. And more importantly, it's very difficult also to create awarenesses so that everybody knows that if there's something happens in terms of their health problems, there could be some solution out there. I mean, that has actually stuck my mind significantly, and I tried to, from that day onwards, I tried to think not as a doctor alone, also to be an artistic person. So in 2010, I came up with an idea of emergency medical care services and Oromo film industry. So my idea is just if, because of the high illiteracy rate in Africa, like someone like my mom and my dad who has never been to school and other siblings, it is possible to teach something valuable by depicting things in audio-visual patterns. That's why I came for the first time with the idea of a film industry. Oromo is my ethnicity, where I came because of nearly 50% of Ethiopian populations are Oromo. That's why I came up with an idea to start with. So I became a pioneer in bringing this idea to media. In a single day show, around 10 million people have watched that television interview. And in collaboration with African Emergency Medicine Federation, I also introduced the idea of developing the specialty of emergency medicine in Ethiopia. We successfully established a year later after that interview in collaboration with Ethiopian North American Health Professional Associations, especially from Canada and United States. That was a successful story, but the idea of also film industry is still pending. I came 5 years ago for family reunion into Australia. Now I became an Australian, part of the Australian community, and I was actually came to know University of Melbourne in 2013. I just went to one of the professors at the Department of Pathology, and just to be associated with this university, and I had also a kind of research idea, and he advised me actually that why not you join, for example, advocacy and leadership part to make a difference among the immigrant communities from East Africa living in Victoria. So I became part of that project, and in 2016 I became part of this university's staff as a research assistant, which is a great privilege. I worked for like 6 or 7 months in that particular research project, and met a wide range of people from immigrant background, because I speak also 4 languages, Amharic, Oromo, and a little bit of Somali, and of course English. So yeah, I mean, so the idea of science, to just cut it short, the idea of science and the idea of art is really very much close to my life story. And it's really an important issue to bring this one as part of, and ideas like this is very much inspiring, and I'm very happy to be part of this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing a very traumatic life history. I could perhaps ask Professor Irving to respond to this in the context of advocacy, because one of the things I think that's been a sub-theme here is, in the end, the best work we can do must have a very ethical foundation. It's come through in Patricia's refusal to work on the commercial side, but to work to public good. And what can we do, Lou, in terms of advocacy for the big problems of lung health? I mean, storm asthma is one, but lung diseases kill an enormous number of people per year on a global basis, particularly in poorer countries.
So I think we learn from stories, particularly personal stories, and then we try and make meaning in life. And unfortunately, science is just a very small part of meaning in life. And we then look for what our gut tells us rather than what our brain tells us. And we put the two together, and exactly as you've done, we then try and advocate for a sort of a more both rational and emotionally intelligent solution. The problem I think we've got at the moment is that we've got many more problems and not enough rational / emotionally intelligent solutions. We seem to be generating problems more quickly than we generate solutions. And I'm very conscious of the fact that, that there's a belief that we process information emotionally, and then it comes up as we think a rational solution. But luckily, we've been programmed to, even the most rational person has been programmed to actually look at it emotionally as well. And I think we need to advocate a lot more emotional intelligence rather than rational intelligence. So advocacy is a way of adding an emotional response to a problem, an emotional response to a rational solution. So we do it in lung health, but many people do it in other areas. And just as a quick anecdote, of course, this year's Nobel Prize winner, the organisation, ICANN, the person whose idea that was, Tilman Ruff, is a Melbourne University doctor, and he was given some money by a family who believed in peace and non-violence, and he ran with the idea. So it was an emotional response to a rational problem.
So, Patricia, through your work, you seem to have an amazing intuitive way to pick out the most effective communicative means for these very complicated problems. The imprints that were attendant to your work and the number of views and the global impact is striking. Where does that come from, that ability to know how to tell the story in a way that's compelling? Because it's a rare skill.
I don't know. I don't know where it comes from.
Writing it down if you do reveal the secret.
I mean, we've all got our strengths, our fortes. I mean, I certainly couldn't, not academic, and I certainly couldn't open a body. I couldn't do anything like that. So, I mean, I think, yeah, I think in life, if you've got a leaning, you go with it, and then you just nurture it over time. I think that's. Would you agree, John, as an artist?
Yeah, I think that's very good, Patricia. And maybe, Gary, we might come to you because in a way you're an exemplar of both parts. And it seems to me that I guess we saw in Patricia's presentation a way that science, or in her case, accident trauma, could be communicated out whilst still retaining the essence of the art. So it seems to me that somewhere in there, in that mix between what the scientist is aiming for and what the artist is aiming for, there's a kind of meeting point where there's a truth for both parties. I just wonder, I mean, you, out of personal crisis, so coming back to what Lewis was saying, a kind of emotional intelligence, I guess, took over where you went on a search for some other deeper kind of resonance or meaning. And out of that came, I know your practice as an artist, and I didn't quite realise how eminent you were as a scientist, but we know that you've somehow been able to bring these two things together. Is there a truth there in both parts?
I think there definitely is. I can only speak from personal experience and reflecting on what other scientists have reported at the moment they create something entirely new. So we often think about science in terms of its current embodiments, its technologies, the thing that we use, and the story of science is always told in a rational way, but the moment of absolute discovery of something completely new almost always comes from, I don't really know. It comes fully, people describe it as coming fully formed from the depths. And my own experience would be around the utility of the culture of art, exemplified in an outstanding institute like VCA, where you put really motivated young artists together with teachers who are the leading practitioners of the country with international reputations and make them sweat on this intangible thing of where's the art. And there is something magical in that quality of education that we need to be very mindful of in Melbourne if we are to be world leading, because simple utilitarian mass education trying to teach these things in a didactic way is not the way to go forward. It's through these very sophisticated teaching models, I think, that we can facilitate this type of thing. And it is an intangible. It's not something that belongs to the beekeepers. We need to understand as a culture, as a society in Melbourne, the importance of institutes like the VCA for fostering this fundamental creativity that in the end is the fountain of our prosperity, really, the engine of our prosperity, creatively, for the creative economy, but also the unexpected catalyst, we hope, of other really new insights into problems where the answers are absolutely not obvious. That's my reflection on it. Oh, yes. So please do tell us who you are.
Thank you very much. I'm Peter Ambrosi. I'm in sustainability, and we've got that terrible problem of communicating climate change. Is science really, for a society, the one thing we can say that gives hope to society? And I suppose to channel Marshall McLuhan, do we need artistic endeavours to be the medium in which we deliver the message of hope to society?
I will ask the panellists. I think science struggles to tell its story. It's so remote from people's normal experience and so counterintuitive that its partnership with art to make it real to people is tremendously powerful. We have the Science Gallery initiative here at the university, and we see this around all of the major science centres in the world, the embracing of artistic modalities to tell the story of science and make it real to people. Because I think it's the artists that have that connection with the usness, the humanity of the problems we have to deal with that creates the trust and the entry point. But let's open this up. That's just my own reflection. We have some fantastic artists here, and we have young scholars, and we have learned professors at the end. Alistair, what's your view on this?
I think you expressed it very well. If we go back to the commentary on advocacy, it has to be built on a little bit of science, but a lot of feeling, and therein lies the medium, that connecting at large requires a Graham or an equivalent. If you had a Graham that explained the need to be sustainable, I think you'd have won a lot of battles.
Lou?
I'm interested in your comment of climate change, and I think we all have a personal response, and we're dominated by our personalities. It's known that half the population thinks that science will find a solution and that we don't need to worry, and then the other half, probably driven by their own personalities, are pessimistic and take an emotional view and say, look, we just can't keep polluting the way we're polluting. So I think the difficulty is that we're never can be separated from our own personality and our own experience and the way we think, particularly over issues that are uncertain.
So I'm actually just mindful of our time because we are running over our allocated time. We can certainly take another question, but we've got more than one. So look, why don't we go, I saw 1, 2, and 3, and 4. We'll do those. And then I think I might ask at the end for our youngest participants to reflect on the future. So we might want to keep these fairly short because of the time here as people flee to their cars. So let's go here first. Oh, with the microphone? Or go here. Sorry, we'll go to cycle.
I've just got a comment to Patricia. A personal situation, my wife had a minor car accident about 6 weeks ago, and she's been, minor being, as you said, she survived and everything's fine except for some rehab that'll take 6 to 12 months. So I just wanted to thank you for your skill in portraying a service, the TAC, which does a fantastic job in rehabilitating people and the service that they give. So it's just a comment to thank you for that.
Hello, I'm Penny and I am an undergrad student at the VCA. It's pretty good. And I make work that is about science, culture, science communication, that sort of thing, space history. So this is my jam. And I'm really excited that you're starting this as a thing because I think that, like you've all touched on, artists being a medium to portray scientific endeavours, and together we can come up with really cool things. So I guess my short question is maybe for Patricia. After your work with Graham, have you had more people contacting you for work like that, or do you foresee more of a future in involving yourself working with scientists or teams to portray scientific ideas?
Okay, well, this is a really complex thing. Graham's a pretty special project, and it's gone all around the world. But it traverses. It's one of those artworks that sits outside just the art world, and that's not always great if you're in the art world. So if I think art is about connecting with other people, in fact, when I make art, I do it to make a sort of catalysts for conversation. I don't make it for myself, to talk about myself or my identity or whatever it is. I do it because I want to talk about issues with people, but not every artist does that. And there are lots of reasons why people make art, and a lot of them are for the market. And so these kinds of things aren't great because they're too available to normal people. So they don't sit easily in the high art world. I know it's a weird thing, and I operate in the high art world as well. But look, it's really complex. Sometimes if you do things that are, and some people can get away with it, like Murakami, Japanese guy. Some people can do it, but not very many. And yeah, look. So have I had any other work? Well, I've got heaps of work. I've got shows all over the world. I've got a big show at Goma next year. But I haven't had more advertising-related work. Not so keen. It's not my area, to be honest. This thing was pretty special. Mm-hmm. My cousin died of a car crash. She was 17. So I was really interested in the TAC, and we're pretty lucky to have it in Victoria, to be honest, because they really do look after people. So I was really particularly interested in this organisation. But yeah, look, it's a funny art world, isn't it, John?
You can say that again.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah. So yeah, I mean, look, I think art can be used to talk about these kinds of ideas, and I do it. But there aren't very many people who do it, and it's not an area that is traditionally seen as an art area. It's a new art area. And I'm happy to go there because I think the world's changing. And also, I don't think we have the luxury to sort of sit back and talk about things that don't matter anymore. Mm-hmm. I think the environment is pushing our hand. Like, we actually do have to do stuff. We actually do have to say things that matter. And that's why I make work that is pretty ethically and politically oriented.
I think we had two more. We make them and then.
Yeah. Okay. My name's Lisette, and my question is, I'm just wondering if anybody knows on this theme that science and art do overlap, whether at the school level, whether there's any more encouragement these days to combine the two, because I very much remember when I was in year 10, I think it was, I was speaking to my careers advisor and I was told you could only do one or the other. So I had said I would love to do continue with my languages and to either be an interpreter or a language teacher, and I was told, but you're good at science, so you should do science. And there was never any talk about, you know, the two being able to combine. So I did go ahead and do science, and I work as a medical scientist now. But there was no encouragement to, you know, that there were other possibilities. I can't draw, you know, if my life depended on it, but, you know, they could have maybe encouraged me to be a scientific writer or something like that, because I love writing. But I'm just wondering if anybody knows if there's any sort of, because, you know...
I'll give you my very, very strong opinion, which is that we don't need STEM education, we need STEAM with a big A in it, with a big art in it. From the pragmatics of the evidence that artistic practices, including music, really work in the brain educationally and have lifelong benefits, including protection from dementia as you age. And art is often seen as a luxury added on at the end for affluent societies to be part of a cafe culture and amusement and help property developers make lovely apartments that have engaging interiors. But it's much more fundamental. It's about how we are as people and how we are successful as a society. So I think STEM alone, without the A, the big art in it, is a false choice in education, but I'm very biased.
I might just add in that my own experience now, just with my own children, is that there is still something of a separation there, that people are guided one way or the other. And, you know, I've got a 16-year-old son who has already said to me, you know, I'm not a STEM kind of guy, I'm more a HAS kind of guy. So they already know at that age. And I know that when I was at high school, I had to fight very hard to be able to do pure maths, applied maths, physics and art as my subject. So I still could have gone either way, and both parts of, you know, the whole interest in computer science and so on has still continued to inform my work even now. I think it's a very, very important thing to try and get both of those aspects for as long as one can.
I think we had one more question. From
Okay, I'm Raymond Mawson. I'm a retired scientist from the CSIRO. And as a scientist, I wore many hats. But I've also been an artist involved in both the musical and visual arts all my life, and an asthmatic all my life. So I well and truly cover this field. But my comment is, I find the conclusions of the ryegrass as being the causal agent, and there's no question from the work you've presented that it is, rather extraordinary, because putting my agricultural science hat on, most of the pastures to the west of Melbourne, you'll barely find a blade of ryegrass. It is from the pastures to the east of Melbourne and to some extent the north and round the Murray River, where there's the irrigated pastures, that you'll find most of the ryegrass. It just doesn't suit Australia's climate if you can't get water to it. So I find that rather surprising. There must have been something truly extraordinary going on with the meteorology that day as well.
Yeah, well, this might be a good chance to ask our two youngest participants, who are at the age of Ehrlich when he made his great discoveries, to comment on this particular question. But then also, why don't you wrap up with your views on where we should go?
Okay. So I think with regard to the ryegrass being implicated, I mean, it certainly is an imported species, as you know, from Europe and North Africa, which isn't, you know, natural to Australia. So my understanding is, and I'm not a meteorologist obviously, but you know, the pastoral lands north and west, and that's where the winds were sort of coming from. So although it might not have been true west, there was that sort of direction. And many of the previous epidemics have implicated that specific, well, ryegrass, particularly in Australia, not all around the world, but particularly in Australia. So yeah, I mean, it was an extraordinary event. And a culmination of lots of extraordinary things, I think, that sort of led to the catastrophic outcomes. But, you know, even in our work that we've done, we are finding that ryegrass is implicated.
Very high sensitisation rates, so obvious exposure.
Correct, 100%.
It's getting here.
Yep. And then in terms of my comments with regard to concluding and where to from here. So I guess I'm speaking from the perspective of a physician and clinician, and I think that, you know, science and art, certainly in terms of what I do every day, is very much interrelated. So whereas we often do find scientific ways of explaining the world or what we see in front of us to try and understand diseases and processes and prognosis and treatment, often there is the art of trying to communicate that to patients, the art of trying to deal with some of the existential and perhaps spiritual aspects of the disease processes, which may not always be an understandable scientific explanation depending on who you're speaking to. And then the other aspect, which I guess Philippe and I was just talking about previously, was public health messaging and how you get that message across. So, you know, there's I think both science and art involved in all those stages. So certainly very promising.
And Philippe, you've described yourself as a sportsman, not an artist, but what's your view?
Just wanting to add about the ryegrass from the northwest. It was also a specific spring season, unusual with a lot of rain, so there was more pollen in the air. And also there's a theory about a second hit with fungus, which we didn't really see sensitization from those patients. There was bodily sensitization to Cladosporium and Alternaria, but not impressive. But that might also be related with wet spring season. From about my perspective about heart. So mainly my experience through medicine and my learning. I think that art is very important. I think we did with complex science, complex medicine, and sometimes just in journal or reviewing or to learn, having nice graphic, nice representation about the body, about how the lungs are working is help us to better understand, and I think it's really important and help us to progress our learning.
Great. So I think what we might do here in view of the time is conclude with some final thanks. So again, to thank Maria, to thank John and Sue Baker from the VCA for their amazing engagement with the initiation of this project, Patricia and our eminent scientific and physician colleagues for their contribution, and also your contribution tonight as audience to the discussion and engagement. So let's thank everyone.